Alrighty, in this video we're going to be talking about view includes. So basically I'm going to show you guys a technique that will allow you to reuse bits of your views within other views by using the include tag, which is available to us through our layout XML files. So it should be a pretty quick video. It's a pretty straightforward feature. I'm also going to use this as an opportunity to show you guys the awesome hierarchy viewer that is given to us by the Android debug tools, and we'll be able to see how that allows us to debug our views a whole lot easier than it would be otherwise. So yeah, let's go ahead and jump right in and show you guys a basic example of how we can include files and talk about some of the more in-depth features of that ability. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new project, and I'm going to call it views part, what are we at? 4, I think? Yeah, we're at 4. Then I'm going to hit next. Now, I will go ahead and this time I will remember to bring my minimum SDK to 4.2 so that we will be using our start, we'll use start and end instead of left and right for our margins and stuff, mostly so Android Studio will just shut up about it. Then we'll hit next. And I'll go ahead and start with the blank activity. Since we aren't going to be doing a whole lot of stuff inside of the activity itself, let's just go ahead and do that so we get a view file created for us. And then I'll leave it as a main activity. Or leave it named as main activity. So let's go ahead and give it a sec to launch. I want to make sure that it generates our project file and it gradles all over our computer, which it's doing right now. So it resolves some dependencies. I don't know why it takes so long. Shouldn't all these dependencies be cached locally? You'd think they would be. Maybe they are, but because it's Java, it's going to take forever anyway. Alright, still executing some tasks and initializing the preview. Still waiting, and we're done. Alright, so let's go ahead and get started and talk about include. So in this example, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to create 2 include files. They're basically just going to be panels. Then I'm going to show you guys an example of how we can have a different layout be presented either horizontally or vertically, and depending on if we're horizontal or vertical, I'm going to arrange those panels slightly different. So we're actually going to end up with a total of 4 views. One for each panel. One panel is going to have a button, the other panel is going to have a text box. Then we're also going to have 2 activity main views. One's going to be loaded in portrait, and one's going to be loaded in landscape. So this is another great opportunity to show you guys some more cool, fun, random stuff that you can do with Android view files. So let's go ahead and get started. Jump into text here, and for this we're going to want to replace this with a linear layout, and then we're going to include our 2 panels inside of here. But we're not going to do that quite yet because we don't have any views to include. So let's jump over to our layout folder, and I'm going to right click and I'm going to hit new, and then I'm going to select layout resource file. So you can think of this as kind of a shortcut of, instead of right-clicking res, selecting new Android resource file, and then selecting layout. It's kind of a shortcut of doing that if you already have a layout folder there. So you really just need to right-click layout, hit new, layout resource file. Now I'm going to go ahead and prefix this as include. That's what I typically do with my view files that aren't necessarily tied to a particular activity, or a particular fragment, or a particular anything else. So if I'm only intending this layout file to be included into other layouts, I will usually prefix it with include. So I'm going to go ahead and call this include underscore, and I'll go ahead and give it a name button panel. And then I'll hit OK. And now I have my layout. So inside of my layout, I'm going to jump into text, and right here I have this linear layout. So let's think for a sec how we want to go ahead and organize our awesome panel, our awesome button panel. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change the layout width to wrap content and wrap content. So the layout height and layout width are now wrap content and wrap content, meaning the root element will expand to the height and the width of the content that's within it. Next up, I want to give some more properties into my linear layout. I'm going to give it a padding of 16 dp. Then I'm going to give it a background. Now what's cool about backgrounds is we can provide a variety of different values here. We can give it a color, just a straight up hex color, or we can give it a drawable being an image, like such as a PNG or JPEG, or a more advanced, there's two other things that we can do with drawables, a more advanced XML syntax or a 9-patch file, which we'll talk about later. But I'm just going to put in a hex color. And the hex color that I'm going to put in is going to come from the Google's Android's material design color guideline thing, whatever. Here, just let me show it to you. It's really cool. You'll want to bookmark this page. So let's go ahead and bring it over here. This is what I use to get a lot of my colors. It's under google.com design spec style color.html. This entire document has a lot of really interesting guidelines about how to work with more modern UIs. It basically outlines Google's new material design aesthetic. So, a lot of fun stuff. I think one of the most important ones, though, that I use all the time is this color palette. I use these colors quite frequently in all the stuff because I am not a designer and I know nothing about color theory, and I think these colors look nice. So let's go ahead and pick one for our button panel. I'll go with this 300 blue. So I'm going to grab this hex value. I'm just going to grab the whole thing, including the hash symbol right there, and I'll move this off to the screen, and then I'll just paste it here in the background. So now you see the way our linear layout is rendering. It is now a 16 or 32 by 32 pixel blue box. But let's go ahead and stuff something in it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a button, because this is our button panel. For the width, I'm going to say wrap content, and for the height, I'm going to say wrap content. Then, for the text, I'm going to say touch me! Exclamation point. Because we are working with a touch device, even though the word click appears everywhere, it really should be touch, because that's how we interact with most Android devices anyway. Okay, so we have this button, it says touch me. Let's go ahead and give this an ID. So I'm going to give it an ID of +ID / include button panel. But so we have right here the layout file that it's in, followed by the name of the thing, and I'm not going to worry about naming this something spectacular because this is pretty much just an irrelevant panel thing. Okay, well that took a really long time to create a very simple include file. So let's go ahead and pick up the pace a little bit and put together our second include. So this concludes our first include. Let's do our second one. I'm going to right-click Layout, go to New, Layout Resource File, and I'm going to say include, and then I'm going to call this the text panel. And then I'll hit OK. So now I have my include text panel. And I'm pretty much going to do the exact same thing we did with our button panel. Because it's basically the same concept. I'm going to give it a layout width of wrap content and a layout height of wrap content. And then I'm going to give it a padding of 16 device-independent pixels. And I'm going to give it a background of, let's do a different color here. Let's do an indigo 300. So I'm going to go with indigo 300. That's the hex value for you guys who don't have that color swatch thing doohickey on your screens. And then let's go ahead and do our text view. So our text view is going to have a layout width of wrap content, layout height of wrap content. We can maybe give it a text size of something like 25 SP. And then I'll go ahead and I'll give it a text of something default. So I'll say this is the text panel. And that's what we see. Maybe that text is a little bit too big. Maybe we can bump it down to 20 SP. And maybe we can also come in here with our text color and make it all white. Or all black. There we go. That gives us good contrast. And then finally we'll end up just giving this an ID. So @+ID /, and we're going to call this include text panel text. And that's it. Those are our two include files. So now we've talked about the two include files. Now we can go ahead in our activity main.xml file, we can go about including them somewhere into our layout. So the first example I'm going to show you guys is including it, well, let's go ahead and change this relative layout into a linear layout and do that example first. Then I'll show you guys how you could incorporate these into relative layouts. just because using this with the linear layout will allow me to also show you guys having a different view or a different layout in horizontal or in vertical orientation. So we'll change this to a linear layout, which requires us to rename both the tags, the opening and the closing. And, of course, the linear layout necessitates that we provide it an orientation. Actually, I don't think it does. I think it defaults to horizontal, but I don't know. I always like putting in the orientation in there to make sure that's explicit what our linear layout should do. Okay, so how do we include something? Not surprisingly, it's with include. And then, how do we specify the layout? With layout. Then, we give it a layout ID, a layout resource. So I'm going to say layout slash, let's do include text panel as the first element. Then let's do another include. I'll say include layout. This time I'm just going to type in, I'm going to hit Control Space to bring up my IntelliSense, my autocomplete window, and I'm going to just say button. And you see right here, it pops right up, so I can hit enter. And then I'll end the tag with the slash end tag syntax. Okay, let's go ahead and try to coerce this preview into refreshing here. Come on, there you go. And now we have our two layouts. We have, this is our text panel, and we have Touch Me, our button. So, yeah, I can go ahead and I can hit F5, or not F5. For a sec, I thought I was in Visual Studio. Hit that that little green button up there, and wait a couple years for Gradle to get its act together. And then I'll select my running getting motion device, which I started off screen. And I'll bring it over for you guys. So that's our two includes. Now, it seems pretty straightforward. Not a whole lot to say about includes at this time. But let's go ahead and do something interesting. So how do we reference these objects? These buttons and the text panel inside of it. Well, it's actually going to be just like what we did before. So if I go ahead and jump over into my Java views part 4 main activity class, and I'll go ahead and nuke our onCreateOptions menu and our onOptions items selected, because we won't be needing those. What I can do is I can go ahead and say, I'm going to say final text view equals cast to text view, find view by ID, r.id. Now look at that. If I do include underscore, notice how these two resources were indeed created. So the two ID resources were created, even though they exist in a layout that's not in any way associated with an activity. So I can do on text. And then I'll go ahead and say view button equals find view by ID, RID include button panel, panel button. And just a quick quiz for you, everyone. Why do you think I declared this final? Talked about it a couple videos ago. Anyway, see if you can figure that out. So I'm going to say button dot set on click set on click listener, new on click listener. Now I'm going to hit enter, so IntelliJ goes about generating all that code that I don't want to type. And then I'm going to say, well, actually, in addition to that, I'm going to declare up at top final int counter equals 0. Then I'm going to say counter plus plus, and I'm going to say text view dot set text. And then I'm going to say integer dot toString counter. This will give us something interesting to talk about. And what's that? Oh, wow. Apparently I forgot how to program. I didn't mean to declare this as a final int. I meant to declare this as a local field. So go ahead and declare your private int counter as a local field and not as a final local variable. And the reason for that is by declaring it final, which is required to access it within the closure, makes it not able to be edited. Really quick, important Java versus C# thing I want to point out here. Now, if you guys are familiar with C#, you will know that int is shorthand for system.int32, which is a value type, right? Well, in Java, you don't have custom user-made value types. You have primitive types, and those primitive types are always going to be primitive types, and they are not objects. They're not treated as objects in the Java language, unlike .NET languages, which treat all primitives as value types, which are actual objects. What does that mean? What does that mean for us? Well, you see how I say to turn this counter into a string so I can pass it into set text? I pass it into a method integer.toString, whereas in the equivalent .NET code would be counter.toString, because counter is an object. In Java, it's going to be integer.toString. Because counter is not an object, you need to have another helper method to deal with turning it into an object. Also, integer is the managed version of an int. It is the boxed object-y version of an int. So, I don't know how many examples we'll see of primitive versus non-primitive basic data types, but I just wanted to point that out for you guys who might be wondering, why am I not doing counter.toString? Anyway, just a quick side note. So let's go ahead and hit run. Oh, by the way, the answer to that quiz is text view has to be final in order to access it from within the onClick closure. So now if I come back here and I press the button, notice how the text changes. That's kind of fun. Anyway, so, yes, the point I'm trying to show you guys is that we can do find view by ID through included elements. That's because of an interesting thing you guys may or may not have noticed about this include syntax. Notice how it is a lowercase I, and also notice how layout is not using the Android XML namespace. Two interesting things about that. And the reason why it's significant is because it suggests that this include is not actually a view. It's not an instantiation of a Java object or something out of the Android framework. Instead, it's a special declaration that is understood by the layout inflator. The layout inflator being the object that's responsible for turning an XML file into a hierarchy of instantiated objects. So we notice that include is special because it's a declaration that's only understood by the layout inflator. And so what does the layout inflator do with it? Well, it basically just copies and pastes whatever the layout we specified was into our view. That's all it does. It's like the include statement from C and C++. So it just takes all the stuff and just plops it right into our linear layout. It does get a little bit more complex than that in certain circumstances, and we'll talk about that later. Alright, so now we have our two layouts. Let's go ahead and show an example of why this whole thing might be useful. Why do we need includes? I mean, I'm sure you guys can see things like headers and footers and sidebars that may be used in every single view or every single activity you might want to put into a layout include. But here's another example of why we might want to use a include. And that is, what if when I rotated my device, so here's my device, and here's my device rotated. If I can find it, where are you? There you go. Notice how it's the same view. But what if I wanted to stack these two panels differently when it was rotated? So you see right now it's rotated and my rotate button just ran off. There we go. And now it's the same. But what if I wanted to be different? What if I wanted these to be horizontally stacked? Well, there's a bunch of different ways to do it. You could absolutely go and you could add a ID to your linear layout, your root linear layout. You can go into main activity. On the onCreate method, you can say, if we're in landscape mode, then set the orientation of this view to blah. If we're in portrait mode, set the orientation of this view to blah. In certain circumstances, that might be preferable to doing what I'm about to do. However, I really want to show an example of how to override layouts on an orientation basis. So instead, I'm going to slightly contrive this whole thing and show you guys how to do that. So this is a really powerful feature of Android layouts, by the way, so don't underestimate this. So over on Layout, I'm going to right-click, select New, Layout Resource File. Now the name I'm going to give it is going to be very significant. It's going to be called activity_main. which surprisingly corresponds to the activity underscore main we already have defined. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to give it a qualifier. So down here on available qualifiers, I'm going to select orientation. Then I'm going to click this little right arrow button, and it says under chosen qualifiers, I now have my orientation, and I'm going to change the screen orientation to landscape. Notice what's interesting right here, directory name. Notice how it changed. It's no longer going to stuff it in the layout directory, it's now going to stuff it in the layout-land directory, which means these files will be loaded when we're in landscape. So let's go ahead and hit OK. Now if I open up my layout, notice what's interesting. Just like our mipmaps under our mipmaps for our IC launcher, we now have two activity main files that are underneath an activity main virtual folder thingy. And we see one is this one, and the second one has land in parentheses, indicating that this is the landscape view. Alright, so let's hop into text. Notice also that the preview automatically put it in landscape mode for us, which is nice of it. Okay, so we have our linear layout. Now, all I'm going to do here is I'm going to change the orientation from vertical to horizontal. Then, otherwise, I'm going to have activity main be identical. However, I do want to go ahead and give it padding. Let's go ahead and give this padding. So I'm going to say padding of dimen, and then what was that value right there? Activity horizontal margin. Dimen activity horizontal margin. So this will give our view padding based on what's defined in this particular resource, this particular dimension resource. Notice how over here it shows that dimension resource, it shows the actual value of it in that little grayed out text, but when I click on it, it expands to what the resource is that I'm locating. Just another quick side note, if you control click on this dimen resource, you will be shown, in this case there's two instances where it's defined, and in this case it's defined under my values dimens XML file. Also, you'll note that this is they have another override for dimens based on screen size, which is cool. Anyway, and just as a quick side note, we'll talk about that stuff more in depth later. Let's go ahead and include our stuff. So I'm going to say include, I'm going to say layout equals button panel, and then I'm going to say, well, let's do text panel just to be consistent. And then I'll say include layout equals button panel. Now if I look in my preview, we see it looks like this. So we've just included these two layouts into our view. So now let's go ahead and hit run. I always forget what the shortcut is for run in this. Shift F10. I usually there's a pack you can download online that gives you all the Visual Studio shortcuts in IntelliJ. I'll show that at some point. That's what I'm used to using anyway. Okay, so this particular example is going to demonstrate not only what I'm wanting to demonstrate, but also what we're going to be talking about in length in the next video. That is, watch this. So you might be sitting here wondering, well, I know that activities are not wired to particular layouts. The only reason that they have a particular layout is when they're created, we set the content view to a particular layout. How does this layout know about this layout, and how do they switch depending on if we're in portrait or landscape? Because watch this. I can go ahead and rotate, and now I have this separate layout. Now I have the vertical layout. Now I have the horizontal layout. So you see, depending on how I'm rotated, I get the different layouts. But you might be wondering, how does it select this? How does it know how to do this? Is it magic? No, it's not magic at all. Let me show you guys a little hint. I'm going to hit touch me a couple times and get up to 16. So now my counter is at 16, and I click touch me a bunch of times. Now let's hit this rotate button. Notice anything interesting? That number went away. See, if I come in here and hit touch me and go up to 10 and rotate, it now says this is a text panel. What this should suggest to you, and we'll talk about this later, is that when I rotate the device, the activity is completely destroyed and recreated. And this code is completely ran again. Why does it do that? Well, one of the reasons is so it can support having different layouts for different orientations. We're going to be talking a lot about how we can combat the issues that arise because of this behavior with Android. But all in all, it's an important thing to be cognizant of. Anyway, so that's pretty cool. So we have our includes. I've shown you guys how to do includes, and I've shown you guys how to create different layouts depending on if you're in portrait or landscape mode. All pretty cool features of the Android view system. But there's also there's a couple more things I want to talk about. So what I want to do is I want to show you guys a very awesome tool that will help you guys in debugging your views. And it's called the Hierarchy Viewer, and it's available to us through the monitor. So you can go ahead and launch the monitor by clicking this little Android doohickey dude up here in the toolbar of Android Studio. Or if you have your Android Tools folder added to your path, you can just type in monitor. So go ahead and do that. Click the little Android doohickey dude up there, or type in monitor in a command prompt, and you'll get the monitor. Now, quick note about running the monitor and running Android Studio at the same time. You will get some contention about who wants to be debugging the application. So right now, our Android Studio is attached as a debugger, and the device monitor wants to attach as a debugger, and they kind of get in a conflict. Now, fortunately for what I want to show you, this is going to be irrelevant, so you can more or less just ignore that. Anyway, this is... or, no, we won't be able to ignore that, will we? Let's go ahead and stop the Android. Where is the stop button? I know there's a way to disconnect from this. Yes, I'm leaving this on video just so you guys can follow along with me completely failing. Let's go ahead and launch this again. Make sure that this is collapsed. I'm going to go ahead and launch the monitor. I'll go ahead and launch the monitor from Android Studio. Maybe once I launch it from Android Studio, then it'll disconnect. Yes, that's apparently why. Okay. So launch it from Android Studio, so Android Studio then disconnects from the debugger, and we don't run any risk of conflict. Fun stuff. Anyway, so this is the Android device monitor. And what you're going to see on the left-hand side is the devices screen. You'll have a tree view of all the devices you have connected to your ADB, or Android Debug Bridge. So if you open this up, you'll see all the processes. And in this case, what we want is CommBuzz Views Part 4. Now, there's a bunch of fun stuff that we can do here. We can inspect the heap, we can inspect allocations, and we can do some basic profiling. We can even open up a file explorer for the entire Android device, assuming that we're rooted in debug mode. We can also see our logcat messages down here. But none of this is what I want to talk about in this video. What I want to show you guys is the hierarchy view. So to do that, you're going to have to change your perspective. Android Device Monitor was built using the Eclipse framework thing. Perspectives are simply the term for different layouts of panels and windows. So to change your perspective, go up here to the top right and select Hierarchy View. If you do not see this button, you can select this button to open perspective and then select Hierarchy View. If you do not see that button, you can go over to Window and select Open Perspective. Actually, let me go ahead and reset this. So this is what you guys are most likely looking at right now. I just reset my perspective. Anyway, switch over to the hierarchy view. And what we're gonna do is we're going to open up Windows. And Windows is going to show us the windows that we have available for us to view the hierarchy of. So remember, right now my device looks like this, right? Now let's come in here and let's say, load that view hierarchy into the tree view. So this little button right here on the toolbar after we've selected Views Part 4, Main Activity. And now what you see, I'm scrolling with my mouse wheel to zoom in and out, and I'm panning with my mouse button to pan around. What you'll see is the hierarchy. Not surprising, because this is the hierarchy view. Now what this shows us is basically what we would see inside of the design view component tree, which we talked about before, but we're seeing this as it appears in runtime. So we're seeing, for example, our phone window decor view. We're seeing a linear layout. Also, by the way, when we're doing this stuff, sometimes the app will crash. The app just crashed on my end. It's not a big deal. Anyway, we have our frame layout. Eventually we'll have so we have our content parent, and then we have our content. So basically everything before this ID content right here is all basically just built-in Android-y, framework-y stuff that we didn't have a part in actually constructing. The content is where our content starts. So we see we have our linear layout, and then we have our, inside of that, I really despise that window. We have our linear layout, and then under our linear layout, we have two other linear layouts, and then we have our corresponding button and our text view. So, this linear layout is what we have in right here, in our activity main. That is that linear layout. These two linear layouts are the ones that come from the include. So you see what happened, quite literally, was the layout inflator went in, grabbed that layout, and just stuffed it straight into where the include tag appeared inside of the main layout file. So, yeah, that's interesting, but the problem is you might not want that. Why might not you want that? Well, in certain circumstances, this can cause your view hierarchy becoming very large and unwieldy. Sometimes you might want to take these elements and copy and paste them into the parent. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's say that our text panel, I'm going to control click on this include text panel to go into it. Let's say this text panel had two text views. And the second one just said subtitle, and I'm going to give it a text color of 000,000. Okay, so let's say this is a text panel and a subtitle. Now, what's the problem with this? Well, I'll show you guys the problem with this. If I hit run, notice how this is a text panel and subtitle, how this appears horizontally, but then when I rotate it, it still appears horizontally. Why is that? Well, it should be obvious. It's because the include is bringing in a linear layout. What if instead we wanted the actual root thing that's including these layouts to decide if it was going to stack horizontally or vertically based on the orientation of the screen? So what if we didn't want it to create a new view group? We just wanted this stuff to be copied and pasted. Now, a naive implementation would look like this, or a naive way of doing this would be like, okay, fine, let's just delete the linear layout and be done with it, right? Well, that's not going to work. It's not going to work because in XML, you always need a root element. You can't get away with this in any way, shape, or form when you're dealing with XML. So, what did Google do? They introduced another layout inflator directive. So I'm going to grab this XML namespace, by the way, because I'm going to need it in a second. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace, so I'm going to copy and paste the XML namespace, then I'm going to replace linear layout with merge. And then I'm going to paste in the XML namespace, and then I'm going to replace the end tag with /merge. So what did I just do? I just went ahead and I replaced the root element with the element called merge. Notice how our background went away. Well, that should be obvious because our background was described by our linear layout. Also notice how both of these views are being stuffed at the top right of the screen. That's because there's Android doesn't know how to orient these elements anymore. it doesn't know how to orient these elements because they're going to be merged into their parent element, or whoever includes this file. Now, what effect does this have? So let's go ahead and run this. I mean, I've been going over what effect this has. I mean, what visually are we going to see differently here? If we run this, notice how now these elements are stacked horizontally. But when I rotate it, they should be stacked vertically. That's because these elements are now being included directly into the parent linear layout. So if I come back here and I capture my, my view hierarchy, notice how, if I zoom out, notice how the button panel still has this linear layout, but these two text views are now direct descendants of this linear layout. So yeah, fun stuff. Okay, there's one more thing I want to go over, I guess, in this particular video. And that is how to increase the flexibility of our included layouts. What I mean by that is, in the case that we don't have a merge, like this, what if I wanted to, at the site of including, I wanted to replace some of these elements? So, like, for example, what if I wanted to change the layout width or the layout height, but on an include by include basis? What if I wanted to give this linear layout an ID, which I'll talk about why we would want to do that in a second here. Well, it turns out that if we don't use the merge tag, we can supply the layout width and the layout height in the include tag. And what'll happen is it'll just set the root tags layout width and layout height. So I'm going to say layout width equals, let's do match parent here, and layout height is wrap content. Now look what happens. Now I've actually changed the layout width and the layout height of the included element, which is really cool. It significantly increases the flexibility of our layouts. Like, for example, let's go ahead and change this linear layout into a relative layout. In addition to changing this to a relative layout, I'm going to wrap this include with a linear layout with a wrap content, and an orientation vertical, just so that those merged views get displayed appropriately. So now that I have a relative layout, what happens with this include, the button panel? Well, now notice that the button panel is stuck at the top left of the screen. Why is that? Well, it's because that's the default behavior with the relative layout. But what if I wanted to override its view parameters for the relative layout? Well, I can do that because of that behavior. I can say layout.alignParentBottom equals true. Now notice what happens. The button panel goes all the way to the bottom because these layout parameters are going to propagate into this linear layout root element of the included tag. So now when I run this, it should look like that. Of course, when I rotate it, it's going to look like this because we didn't change the landscape view. But yeah. Okay, so let's go ahead and do one more example. What if we had two includes of the button panel? So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to create another include of the button panel, so I'm going to copy and paste that. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, I'm going to give the top include an ID. I'm going to say ID / activity main button panel bottom. Then on the second include, I'm going to say a layout above button panel bottom. And then I'm going to say, I'm going to remove the layout align parent bottom. And then I'm going to say margin bottom equals 16 dp. Okay, so again, this ID attribute propagates into this linear layout. So when they get merged, I am able to create another include and have it positioned relatively from the first include. Okay, so now I have two buttons here with the same ID. Let's go ahead and hit run and see what happens. Well, actually, I'm hitting run so I can show you guys a hierarchy viewer. So anyway, so I have it touch me, I can touch this button, and nothing happens. But the second button, notice how I get the behavior of the number incrementing. So why is that happening? Well, if we go ahead and pop open our hierarchy viewer, and click over here and hit run, you'll notice that we have two buttons, and they both have the same ID. So when I request the view to find a view by ID, what's going to happen is the first one is going to be returned, and the second one is going to be effectively ignored. So how would I fix this? How would I make it so both buttons have an on-click behavior? Well, in this case, you already kind of see the answer. Notice how this linear layout has an ID? What if I went on this layout and I got this view, and then I told this view to find its child by ID. Then I gave this linear layout an ID, and I told it to find its button by ID. So let's go ahead and show that as an example. I'm going to come down here, and I'm going to give this second layout down here an ID. So I'm going to say ID equals plus ID slash activity main button panel top. Then I'm going to go into main activity. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and, I'm going to go ahead and say view top button panel equals find view by ID, RID, button panel top. I got to that by just typing in top and hitting enter. And then view bottom button panel equals find view ID, words, I can word. I swear I can word. Main button panel bottom. Then on this button, I'm going to rename this button to top button. So I'm going to rename it to top button. I could have used the refactoring built into IntelliJ if I wanted to. So top button, right now it's saying top button equals find view by ID with no qualifier. But watch this. I can say top button panel dot find view by ID. So the find view by ID method actually comes from the view object itself, meaning I can find nested views by IDs by just invoking the find view by ID on top of a parent. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say view bottom button equals bottom button panel, find view by ID. And I'm going to pass in the same ID I did onto the top panel. I'm going to say include button panel. Then I'm going to say bottom button dot set on click listener new on click listener, and in this case for the bottom button I'm going to say counter minus minus, and then I'm going to say text view dot set text dot integer dot to string counter. Now I'm going to run this. I do want to point out, however, I just broke this activity for the horizontal landscape. Or the horizontal landscape. Seriously, I swear I can word. The horizontal layout. Why? Because the horizontal layout doesn't define include activity main button panel top and activity main button panel bottom. Meaning this on the horizontal layout will return null. Meaning this line right here is going to throw a null reference exception because I'm trying to use a view that doesn't exist. We're just going to ignore that for now. Instead focus on the portrait. So now, if I click on my top button, we get incremented. And when I click on my bottom button, we get decremented. So, yeah. Stuff and things. Alrighty, so I think this pretty much wraps up all I wanted to talk about in this video. We went surprisingly in-depth into the include construct. I hope you guys learned a lot about that sort of stuff, and I hope you guys are getting a better idea of how to work with views inside of layouts. Wow, how to work with layouts inside of Android is what I meant to say. Anyway, guys, we'll see you in the next video.